The whispers of dawn often found Elias in quiet contemplation, a man whose very name resonated with reverence throughout his community. He was more than just a leader. He was a pillar, his faith a beacon, his moral compass an unyielding guide for all who sought wisdom. His pronouncements carried the weight of conviction. His actions mirrored the devotion he preached, and for years, his people thrived under his righteous stewardship. Yet, beneath the veneer of unwavering piety, subtle cracks had begun to form. A burgeoning pride, a quiet self-righteousness started to take root in the fertile ground of his accomplishments, subtly twisting his perspective, one barely perceptible shift at a time. Then came the mandate. It descended upon Elias not as a gentle suggestion, but as an undeniable resonant command from the higher power he had so faithfully served. The instruction was clear, stark, and profoundly difficult. It demanded a sacrifice, not of material wealth, but of personal comfort, of the very power and influence he had meticulously cultivated. A deep, unsettling tremor ran through him. His initial reaction was a visceral reluctance, an internal struggle that raged within the confines of his soul. He wrestled with the implications, with the sheer audacity of being asked to relinquish that which he believed was his by divine right. Despite the internal turmoil, the command remained, unwavering. And Elias, in a moment that would forever alter his trajectory, chose to defy it. He actively, consciously, turned his back on the divine instruction. His mind, once a conduit for divine will, became a forge for justification. He meticulously crafted logical, self-serving arguments, weaving a narrative that painted his disobedience as prudent, even necessary. A fleeting rush of liberation washed over him, a dangerous thrill born of rebellion. But it was fleeting, quickly succeeded by a gnawing, unsettling unease that settled deep in his gut. The universe, it seemed, was not indifferent to his choice. Small, unsettling events began to punctuate the rhythm of daily life, subtle omens signaling a profound displeasure from the heavens. A crop failed unexpectedly in a season of plenty. A vital well ran dry without explanation, minor misfortunes that, individually, might be dismissed, but collectively whispered of a deeper disquiet. His closest friends and even members of his own family, discerning the shift in his spirit, approached him with genuine concern, their voices soft with counsel, their eyes filled with worry. Elias, however, dismissed their anxieties with a wave of his hand, categorizing them as mere coincidences, or worse, misunderstandings of his profound leadership. He saw their concern as weakness, their counsel as a challenge to his authority. His defiance, once a quiet act, began to harden into an unyielding stubbornness. The subtle pride that had first emerged now swelled into an undeniable arrogance. He actively sought out those who would echo his sentiments, who would validate his choices, surrounding himself with voices that reinforced his newfound convictions. The quiet, internal voice of doubt, once a persistent whisper, was now systematically suppressed, drowned out by the chorus of affirmation he curated around himself. An insidious, unseen hand began to work its will upon Elias. A subtle shift in his perception took hold, almost imperceptible at first. He became less receptive to reason, his arguments growing more rigid, more entrenched in his own increasingly isolated views. It was a chilling sensation, a growing awareness that his choices were no longer entirely his own, that an unseen force was guiding his hand, not towards righteousness, but deeper into the labyrinth of his own making. Then came the stark warning, a prophetic figure, whose words had always carried undeniable weight, stood before Elias, eyes blazing with an unsettling truth. "Your heart, Elias," the figure declared, "is being hardened." Elias scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. He believed himself to be in absolute control, the master of his own destiny, but the words, though dismissed, planted a seed of chilling realization, the path of return. The road back to his former self was narrowing with each defiant step, perhaps already closed off forever. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The chilling realization, though momentarily dismissed, lingered in the periphery of Elias's consciousness as a faint, unwelcome echo. Yet, His growing stubbornness quickly smothered any nascent fear. His defiance, once a private struggle, now manifested openly, creating an ever-widening chasm between him and those who had once been his closest allies and dearest loved ones. Their quiet counsel had transformed into pleas, then into resigned silence, and finally into outright avoidance. Those who dared to challenge his increasingly erratic decisions, who questioned his wisdom or his methods, were swiftly and ruthlessly cast aside. Their loyalty, once cherished, was now deemed a liability, a threat to his burgeoning authority. Elias meticulously curated his inner circle, surrounding himself exclusively with sycophants whose unwavering agreement and effusive praise served to reinforce his every delusion, feeding the monstrous pride that now consumed him. Their whispers of affirmation were a balm to his increasingly fragile ego, drowning out the few dissenting voices that still dared to speak. His acts of disobedience, once subtle and internal, escalated dramatically, becoming overt challenges to the divine will he had sworn to uphold. He enacted policies that directly contradicted ancient covenants, pursued ventures that prioritized personal gain over communal well-being, and made pronouncements that twisted sacred texts to justify his tyrannical rule. These actions, ironically, often brought short-term gains, a momentary surge of power or wealth, which Elias proudly presented as irrefutable proof of his superior judgment and divine favor. He reveled in these superficial victories, convinced they validated his every choice, every act of defiance. The community, however, paid a devastating price. Their once thriving lands began to wither, their traditions eroded, and a pervasive sense of fear replaced the former peace and prosperity. Elias, blinded by his own self-importance, interpreted any negative consequence, any misfortune that befell his domain, not as a repercussion of his own choices, but as malicious attacks orchestrated by his perceived enemies. He saw conspiracies where there were only consequences, treachery where there was only truth. His capacity for empathy, once a hallmark of his leadership, diminished significantly, replaced by a cold, calculating indifference to the suffering of others. The cries of his people, once a source of genuine concern, now sounded like the irritating protests of the ungrateful, easily dismissed as weakness or disloyalty. He truly believed he was in control, a master strategist, outwitting unseen adversaries, when in reality he was merely dancing to the tune of his own hardened heart. A pivotal moment arrived, a final, clear chance for repentance, a glimmer of light in the deepening shadows of his soul. An unexpected crisis, a profound tragedy struck his domain, one so devastating it brought even his most ardent sycophants to their knees, begging for divine intervention. For a fleeting instant Elias felt a tremor of his old self, a flicker of genuine fear, a whisper of regret. The thought of humility, of seeking forgiveness, crossed his mind, a fleeting, almost painful sensation. But the ingrained habit of defiance, the overwhelming compulsion to resist, proved too strong. He chose defiance again, doubling down on his previous actions, blaming the crisis on external forces, on the weakness of his people, on anything but himself. This act, born of an unyielding will, sealed his fate, making genuine change, true repentance, an impossibility. The path back was now irrevocably closed. The consequences of his actions, once subtle, now became inescapable, a relentless tide of divine judgment. Catastrophic events plagued his life and his entire domain. Famine stalked the land, pestilence ravaged the livestock, and external enemies, emboldened by his internal weakness, began to encroach upon his borders. Yet, even in the face of utter devastation, Elias remained unyielding, his defiance absolute. He saw these calamities not as judgment, but as tests, as further proof of his enemy's malice, further justification for his iron rule. He refused to bend, refused to acknowledge his role in the unfolding tragedy. Beneath the hardened exterior, however, there were fleeting, agonizing flashes of his past self, momentary glimpses of the devout man he once was. These were brief, sharp stabs of self-awareness, quickly extinguished by an overwhelming, almost physical compulsion to resist, to maintain his defiant posture. He was trapped in a torturous cycle of self-justification and defiance, a prisoner of his own making, unable to break free from the chains of his hardened heart. It was during this period of escalating chaos that betrayal, a bitter fruit of his own actions, finally ripened. A close confidant, a family member who had stood by him through much of his descent, driven to desperation by Elias's tyranny and the suffering of their people, finally acted. This betrayal, a desperate attempt to save what little remained, was a direct result of Elias's own hardened actions, his inability to see beyond his own will. Elias, consumed by his unyielding pride, unable to comprehend his own fault in the matter, saw only treachery. His eyes, once filled with divine light, now burned with a cold, vengeful fire. He vowed vengeance, a promise that would only hasten his own inevitable ruin. The vow of vengeance, a bitter oath sworn in the crucible of his crumbling domain, became Elias's final, desperate anchor. His power, once absolute, now hemorrhaged from every wound inflicted by his own choices. The empire he had meticulously built, not with faith but with fear, began its catastrophic collapse. Cities that had once thrived under his early righteous leadership now lay in ruins, their people scattered, their hopes extinguished. Yet even as the last vestiges of his reign crumbled around him, even as the walls of his once impregnable fortress began to crack, Elias's defiance remained unyielding, a perverse monument to his broken will. He stood amidst the debris, a king without a kingdom, a leader without followers, a symbol of ultimate, unyielding rebellion against a fate he believed unjust. His eyes, devoid of fear or regret, still burned with a cold, hard resolve, refusing to concede defeat, even to the inevitable. Moments arose like fleeting glimpses of sunlight through storm clouds, where an outside force or an individual, often a former ally burdened by lingering hope, attempted to offer a path to redemption. They spoke of reconciliation, of humility, of a chance to rebuild not just his domain, but his very soul. They presented opportunities for Elias to acknowledge his errors, to seek forgiveness, to turn back from the precipice. But his hardened heart, encased in layers of pride and self-justification, was incapable of accepting such grace. True remorse was an emotion alien to him now, replaced by a deep-seated resentment against those who dared to suggest his choices were anything less than righteous. The tragedy was not merely his spectacular fall from grace, but his utter inability to choose otherwise, to grasp the lifeline extended. He was a prisoner in a cell of his own making, its bars forged from his own stubbornness, the key forever out of reach. His pursuit of vengeance, a singular consuming obsession, led to further loss, further suffering. The betrayer, the confidant who had acted out of desperation, was hunted relentlessly, their family scattered, their legacy tarnished. Elias found no solace in this retribution, no satisfaction in the destruction he wrought. Each act of vengeance, each life ruined in his name, left him more empty, more hollow than before. The cycle of pain generated by his choices seemed endless, a self-perpetuating maelstrom, dragging everyone, including himself, deeper into despair. The supposed triumph of his revenge was a bitter, fleeting taste, leaving only ash in his mouth. The final confrontation arrived not with a roar, but with a mournful whisper of the wind through desolate ruins. It was the prophetic figure, older now, their face etched with sorrow, who stood before Elias amidst the skeletal remains of his former palace. Elias, gaunt and broken in appearance, yet still radiating an aura of chilling defiance, faced his accuser. There was no grand battle, no dramatic struggle, only a quiet exchange that echoed the chasm between two irreconcilable worldviews. The prophet spoke of broken covenants, of wasted potential, of a heart irrevocably lost. Elias, though defeated in every conceivable way, maintained his defiant stance to the very end. His final words were not of regret, not of repentance, but of bitter accusation, blaming the divine, blaming his former allies, blaming everyone but himself for the ruin that surrounded them. The aftermath was a landscape of desolation, a stark testament to the lasting impact of Elias's choices. His community, once vibrant, now struggled to rebuild from the ashes of his tyranny. His family, once proud, carried the heavy burden of his name, a legacy of sorrow and destruction. The story of Elias became a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones, a somber reflection on how a once good heart, brimming with faith and promise, could be irrevocably lost to the insidious grip of pride and unyielding defiance. The chilling question lingered in the desolate air, echoing through the minds of those who survived. Was Elias's heart hardened by divine will, a direct act of judgment, or was it merely the terrifying consequence of his own repeated choices, a path God allowed to solidify beyond turning back? The ending left the audience with a profound, unsettling thought, a terrifying implication that stretched beyond Elias himself. Could this happen to anyone? Could the seeds of pride, left unchecked, grow into an impenetrable fortress around the human heart, making genuine return an impossibility, leaving one forever trapped in the echoes of a broken will?